On Christmas night, my dad snapped that I was the disgrace of the family, a trash worker too dirty to sit at their perfect table. My stepmom smirked like she had won. My sister leaned into her fiancé and whispered loud enough for everyone to hear, and the room erupted in laughter that stung worse than any slap. For years, I had swallowed their insults in silence, trying to prove my worth. But that night, something in me refused to bend. I stood up, slowly pushed back my chair, and walked to the front door while their mocking voices followed me. The second I opened it, the winter air rushed in, and 10 black limousines stood gleaming in the snow waiting for me. Their laughter froze, their glasses stopped mid-air, and not a single person at that table knew what was about to happen. That was the night everything shifted, and the truth they had buried for years came crashing into the open. Christmas lights twinkled across the long dining table, casting soft reflections on the polished silverware and crystal glasses. The air was thick with the scent of roasted turkey cinnamon and pine from the giant tree glowing in the corner of the room. My family's estate in Nashville always looked like something out of a glossy holiday magazine, a showcase of perfection for the neighbors and anyone who happened to step inside. But that night, December 25th of 2024, there was nothing perfect about what unfolded. I sat quietly at the far end of the table, smoothing the edge of my napkin, trying to steady my breath. The fire crackled in the stone fireplace, but the warmth didn't reach me. I could hear the faint ticking of the granddad clock in the hallway, each second louder than the next, as though it was counting down to something inevitable. Around me, the laughter rose and fell like waves. My dad, Mark, sat tall at the head of the table, his face red from wine, his eyes sharp with that familiar mixture of pride and disdain. Sarah leaned into her fiancé Aiden, flashing her ring to anyone who hadn't admired it yet. The diamonds caught the candlelight like they were desperate to outshine everyone else. Nancy, my stepmom, was perched beside Dad, dressed in a pale silk blouse that smelled faintly of expensive perfume, her lips pulled into a smile that was both sweet and sharp. I had been invisible most of the night, as usual. My plate of turkey and green beans sat mostly untouched. I kept thinking if I stayed quiet, maybe the evening would pass without incident. Maybe I could slip out early and call it a night, avoiding the sting I knew was waiting. But Dad had never been one to let silence win. His glass slammed against the table so hard that some of the red wine splashed onto the linen cloth. Conversation stopped mid-sentence, forks froze in the air. Every head turned toward him. His voice cut through the room like a blade. "You are the disgrace of this family." His eyes locked on me. "Of all the jobs in the world, you went and chose to be a trash worker." Seriously, the words fell heavy, but they were not unfamiliar. I had heard them in different forms for years, always coded in the same contempt. Still hearing them at that table on Christmas with every relative watching was like being stripped bare. I felt the blood rush to my face, hot and humiliating. My hands gripped the napkin tighter. The silence around me was worse than his words. Not a single person spoke up. Not an uncle, not a cousin, not even Sarah, who had once shared a bedroom with me when we were kids. The absence of their voices told me exactly where I stood. Nancy leaned slightly forward, her manicured hand brushing the stem of her wine glass. Her smile widened in a way that made my stomach churn. "Too stinky to sit at our table," she said softly, but loud enough for everyone to hear. A ripple of laughter moved through the relatives, forced and awkward, but laughter nonetheless. Sarah tilted her head, smirk, tugging at her lips. She whispered something to Aiden, and he chuckled as though it were the funniest thing he had heard all night. The humiliation pressed against my chest so tightly I thought I might choke. The clinking of silverware resumed slowly, conversations picking up again as though nothing had happened, as though my dad hadn't just carved me open in front of everyone. My ears buzzed, and I could barely taste the bitterness of the wine I raised to my lips to steady myself. And then it came. A sound from outside, faint at first like a low hum under the floor. The vibration grew stronger, engines pulling closer one after another. Conversations faltered. Heads turned toward the windows. Through the frosted glass, beams of headlights cut across the room, scattering over the walls and ceiling. The noise was steady, deliberate, too organized to be anything casual. One by one, shadows stretched long across the driveway. Then the shape of not one, not two, but 10 black limousines slid into view, lining the circular drive like an army arriving on cue. Their polished sides reflected the glow of the Christmas lights strung along the roof, their engines purring in unison. Gasps broke through the dining room. Forks clattered onto plates. Sarah was the first to move, phone in hand, her nails clicking furiously as she angled toward the window. "Oh my God," she whispered, already snapping photos. A tiara emoji would no doubt appear in her story before dessert was served. Aiden leaned closer, grinning at her screen like this was just another prop for their curated life. Nancy's fingers trembled as she adjusted her wine glass, the red liquid sloshing dangerously close to the rim. Mark's posture stiffened, his jaw clenched, eyes narrowing as if he could will the sight away. The laughter that had filled the room only seconds before was gone, replaced by the hum of engines outside and the heavy silence inside. I didn't move, I didn't rush to the door, I didn't explain. I simply raised my glass again, the crystal cool in my hand, and took a slow sip. The wine coated my tongue, bitter and rich, grounding me in the stillness. Every pair of eyes swung back to me, searching, demanding, waiting for me to explain what those limousines were doing outside our home. But I gave them nothing. My silence was deliberate, heavier than any outburst could have been. Sarah lowered her phone, her smile faltering as she looked at me like she was seeing me for the first time. Nancy's smirk cracked unease flashing across her carefully painted face. Even Dad, who had always relished the role of judge and executioner, seemed caught between confusion and something he would never admit was fear. I set my glass down gently, the soft clink against the china louder than any voice in that moment. Then I leaned back in my chair, folded my hands in my lap, and let them all sit in their own questions. For the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. It felt inevitable. Christmas night air pressed against the windows. The faint hum of engines outside already coiled around the silence in the dining room. I pushed my chair back slowly, the scrape against the hardwood echoing like a warning bell. No one spoke. Their forks hovered mid-air. Wine glasses trembled just slightly in their hands, but no one dared to breathe too loudly. My legs felt steady as I rose, steadier than I expected, as though my body had been waiting for this moment longer than I realized. My hand brushed against the back of the chair as I stepped forward. All eyes tracked me, darting from my face to the doorway behind me, as though they already feared what might come next. Dad's jaw was set tight, his knuckles white around the stem of his wine glass. Nancy tilted her head just enough to let the diamonds in her earrings catch the firelight. Sarah's phone hovered inches above her lap, recording maybe or poised to. I walked across the long stretch of polished wood floor toward the front door. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall beat against my chest like a second heart. My heels clicked, each sound sharper than the last. Until I reached the brass handle, I pulled the door open. The sound hit first, a layered growl of engines idling in the cold December night. Then the light followed. Headlamps cut through the falling snow, white beams glancing across the long driveway that curved through the property. And there they were, one after another, stretched into the distance like a black river broken into pieces. 10 limousines, sleek and polished, lined in perfect order. Exhaust curled into the night like smoke signals, rising and vanishing into the dark sky. The drivers stood outside their vehicles, coats buttoned, hats firm against the wind. In unison, they shifted, folding their hands behind their backs, their posture as crisp as the winter air. The glow of the Christmas lights strung across the eaves reflected off the cars, a shimmer of gold and red dancing across the black paint. Gasps broke the silence behind me. Sarah was the first to move. She leaned toward the doorway, her phone raised, snapping photo after photo, the fake laugh tumbling out of her throat too loudly. "This is wild," she said, forcing brightness into her voice, like she was narrating an Instagram reel. But her hands shook, and when she lowered the phone, the screen glared back with the reflection of her pale face. Nancy's wine glass clinked against the table as she set it down. "What is this circus?" she murmured, her voice soft but strained. "Jessie, what did you do? Rent a parade to prove a point?" Her smile was thin, a stretched thread ready to snap. Dad rose halfway from his chair, leaning one hand against the table for balance. The authority he once wielded with his voice alone seemed to falter, swallowed by the engines outside. His words came out harsher than intended, cracking like wood in a fire. "Enough of this nonsense. Shut the door." I didn't move. Instead, I stepped fully into the doorway, the cold air spilling around me, tugging at my hair and dress. I let it in, let it fill the room behind me with the bite of winter, because for once I wanted them to feel what it was like to sit in discomfort. The drivers did not look at Dad. They didn't look at Nancy or Sarah or any of the relatives now craning their necks to see past me. Their eyes remained steady, facing forward, waiting. And though no one said it out loud, every person in that room could see it. The limousines weren't for them. I turned slowly, my gaze sweeping the table. Nancy's lips pressed into a thin line. Sarah tucked her phone against her chest, as though hiding the evidence of her own awe. Dad's face was flushed, the red creeping higher. Not from wine this time, but from something closer to fear. "They didn't come here for you," I said quietly, my voice even, cutting through the tension without needing to rise. "They came for me." The words settled like heavy snow, soft yet impossible to ignore. No one moved, no one laughed, even the fire seemed to wait. I stepped back just enough for the doorway to frame me fully, the glow of headlights washing across my shoulders. Behind me, the drivers shifted again, a precise movement that sent another ripple of unease through the room. Sarah broke the silence, her laugh too high, too brittle. "Jessie, come on, you're playing. You hired these cars to show off, didn't you?" Her eyes darted toward her fiancé, Aiden, desperate for him to join in to validate her version of the story. But Aiden only stared past me, his mouth slightly open, his expression caught between admiration and confusion. Nancy leaned forward, her perfume drifting sharp into the air. "If this is some stunt, Jessie, it's tasteless. You've embarrassed yourself enough tonight. Close the door and sit down before you freeze us all." Her voice trembled at the edges, and I noticed the way her hand gripped the stem of her glass as though she needed it to anchor her. Dad's fist slammed against the table. Silverware rattled, plates shifted. "Sit down, Jessie," he thundered. But his voice, that old hammer of control, no longer landed the same way. The drivers outside hadn't flinched. The limousines hadn't moved. The authority he believed he owned had evaporated in the white clouds of exhaust drifting through the air. I didn't sit. I let the silence thicken, the cold seep deeper into the room, the weight of their uncertainty pressing heavier with each passing second. For once, I wasn't the one shrinking under their stares. They were shrinking under mine. Then, from the front of the line of cars, a single horn tapped lightly. Not loud, not demanding, just a signal. The drivers adjusted, stepping forward in unison, boots crunching against the snow. They lined the path to the doorway, 10 pairs of gloved hands folding neatly in front, eyes trained on me. Nancy's breath hitched. Sarah muttered something under hers, words that dissolved before they left her mouth. Dad gripped the edge of the table so tightly I wondered if the wood would splinter beneath his hands. And then came the sound that split the room in two. A knock at the open door. Firm. 3 taps. I didn't turn immediately. I let the moment hang there suspended, so they could all feel the shift in power, the way the night had stopped belonging to them. Then slowly I glanced over my shoulder, the headlights spilling across my face. The knock came again, steady, patient, like the person outside knew exactly who they were there for and had no intention of leaving without me. Behind me, I heard the shuffle of chairs, the mutter of uncertain voices. Someone whispered my name. Sarah's phone dinged with a notification loud in the silence, making her flinch. I smiled just enough for them to see it and stepped 1 pace closer to the threshold. The night was no longer theirs. It was mine, and the knock waited for me to answer. The knock at the door reverberated through the dining room, steady and confident like it had been rehearsed. The engines outside hummed in the cold night. 10 limousines idling in perfect formation, their exhaust rising in white clouds. The fire crackled faintly behind me, but no one at the table moved. They were waiting for me, though most of them did not understand why. I tightened my grip on the brass handle and pulled the door open wider. The winter air rushed in sharper this time, tugging at the edges of the linen tablecloths, rattling the crystal glasses with a faint tremor. Then she appeared. Leona stepped across the threshold as though the house already belonged to her. Her navy wrap coat draped perfectly against her frame, a silk scarf at her throat catching just enough of the light to glow. Her pearl earrings gleamed like punctuation marks at the edges of her confident face. She didn't look around nervously, didn't glance at the limousines lined in the driveway. She walked directly toward me, her heels clicking with deliberate grace. And when she reached my side, she placed one hand gently on my shoulder. "I heard you were dining here tonight," she said, her voice warm, yet cutting through the silence like a bow across a violin string. "I owe so much to this woman." The room stiffened. For the first time all night, Nancy's smile slipped. She blinked rapidly as if trying to place Leona, as if scrambling through her memory for some connection that would explain this scene. Sarah sat frozen, her phone still in her hand but forgotten, her thumb hovering uselessly above the screen. Dad shifted his weight and cleared his throat, the deep rumble of his voice suddenly hesitant. Leona didn't acknowledge any of them yet. She turned to face the table, her hand still on my shoulder, grounding me in a way that made my chest feel both heavy and light. "If this is your family," she said calmly, "they should be very proud." No one responded. The silence wasn't the same kind I had grown used to, the silence of dismissal, of invisibility. This was the silence of people being forced to rearrange their understanding of the world. I glanced at Sarah first. She finally lowered her phone to the table, the clatter of the case against the wood startling in the stillness. She tried to smirk, to find some way to twist this into a joke, but her lips only twitched awkwardly. Aiden looked at her and then back at Leona. his mouth slightly open, his polished demeanor cracking around the edges. Nancy recovered first, though her voice was tighter than usual. "And you are?" she asked, trying for polite but failing. Her eyes cut quickly toward Dad as if begging for him to take back control. Leona smiled. Leona Marshall, CEO of Clarion Ventures. She let the words hang in the air long enough for them to register. A few of the cousins shifted uncomfortably, their forks scratching faintly against porcelain. Even Dad's eyes narrowed with a flicker of recognition. Clarion Ventures wasn't just a company. It was a name that carried weight in boardrooms and headlines. The kind of name that made men like my dad want to sit a little taller at a dinner table. And Jessie Leona continued squeezing my shoulder just slightly. "Is one of the most visionary partners I've ever worked with." The words landed like glass shattering on stone. Sarah's smirk collapsed entirely. Nancy's face tightened, her nostrils flaring the way they always did when she felt her grip slipping. Dad leaned forward, his forearms pressing against the table, but he said nothing. I stayed quiet too. I didn't need to speak. The weight of Leona's presence, the certainty in her voice, was enough. One of my uncles coughed the sound too loud, too forced, like he needed to puncture the silence just to survive it. My aunt shifted in her chair and glanced at Nancy, waiting for a signal. None came. Leona moved further into the room, her gaze sweeping across the long table with an ease that made it seem like she had attended 1,000 such dinners and conquered every one of them. She placed a small clutch on the sideboard and unbuttoned her coat, revealing a simple black dress that looked effortless and expensive all at once. Dad finally spoke, his voice low gravelly. "This is a private family gathering." Leona's smile never faltered. "Yes, and I was invited." His eyes snapped to me, but I didn't flinch. I simply lifted my wine glass and let the liquid touch my lips, steady as stone. "By whom?" Nancy asked, her tone sharper now, her composure unraveling thread by thread. "By me," I said finally, my voice calm, deliberate. "She came for me." That was the moment, the pivot. The air in the room shifted dense with the realization settling in. Sarah's fiancé, Aiden, broke the tension with a thin laugh. "Well, isn't that something, Jessie? Always full of surprises." But his laugh didn't reach his eyes, and when Leona turned to look at him, he lowered his gaze instantly, fiddling with his fork as though it might rescue him. Leona's eyes swept back to Dad. "I hope you don't mind my interruption, Mark." But I couldn't let this evening pass without acknowledging Jessie's accomplishments. Too many people underestimate her. And I make it a point never to sit silent when someone I respect is being erased. Dad's mouth opened then closed. He lifted his wine glass only to set it back down without drinking. His hands flexed once against the tablecloth. Nancy forced a laugh, brittle as glass. "Accomplishments." "Jessie collects garbage, doesn't she?" Leona's head tilted ever so slightly, her expression almost pitying. "Is that what you think?" She looked back at me, then at the room. "Do you know what Clean Horizon has done in the last 3 years? Do you know how many cities now run more efficiently because of her systems? Do you know how many jobs she's created for people who were overlooked?" The questions weren't meant for answers. They were meant to expose. Sarah reached for her wine, her hand shaking, and spilled a drop onto the white cloth. She swore under her breath. The drivers outside remained lined up, their silhouettes visible through the frosted windows, a silent wall of witnesses. The hum of the limousines was constant, a reminder that the world outside this dining room was watching, waiting. Leona pulled out a chair at the end of the table and sat gracefully, crossing one leg over the other. She looked entirely at ease, as though the room had shifted to accommodate her presence. She reached for the bread basket, tore a piece gently, and smiled. "Don't let me stop dinner. Please, continue." No one moved. I took my seat again, deliberately slow, the scrape of the chair echoing. I set my napkin across my lap and lifted my fork, but I didn't eat. I just let the silence breathe. Dad finally leaned back, his chair creaking. His voice dropped low, almost a growl. "What are you trying to prove, Jessie?" I met his eyes. "Nothing. I don't have to prove anything anymore." Nancy shifted in her chair, her eyes darting between me and Leona, her carefully constructed confidence unraveling. Sarah looked like she wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. Leona broke the silence again, her tone light but cutting. "The proof is already here, Mark. It's outside in the driveway. It's in the contracts signed, the systems running, the people employed. Jessie doesn't need this table's approval. She already has the world." The words landed hard. The silence that followed was suffocating. I let it settle, let it wrap around them like a mirror they couldn't escape. And then, as if on cue, the knock came again. This time not tentative, not patient, firm, demanding. Every head turned toward the open door. The world outside was still waiting to come in. And I knew this night was only beginning. The second knock was louder, sharper, as if whoever waited outside no longer cared about patience. It rattled the air in the dining room. My relatives stiffened in their seats, eyes darting to one another in frantic silence, each person silently hoping someone else would move first. The sound of engines outside continued to hum in steady unison, the line of limousines unbroken, a presence impossible to ignore. I set my fork down deliberately. The metal clicked against porcelain, a small sound but enough to make half the table flinch. My pulse stayed steady, though. The voice in me that had always whispered to keep my head down was gone, replaced by something calmer, stronger. I rose from my chair again, my slate gray dress brushing lightly against my legs, and turned toward the door. The cold air swept through the room as I stepped back to the threshold. Snowflakes had begun to fall more heavily, dusting the limousines with a thin white sheen. The drivers still stood in their perfect line, unmoving. At the front of the line, near the first limousine, the rear door opened slowly as if in ceremony. Out stepped a man in a dark overcoat, his shoulders broad, his posture commanding without needing words. Behind him followed another, then another. 3 men in total, all dressed sharply, all with the kind of composure that made them look less like guests and more like emissaries. They walked in rhythm up the driveway, their shoes crunching on the snow, until they reached the porch. One of them stepped forward and knocked again, firm and final. I turned just enough to see my family's faces. Nancy's hand clutched at the pearl necklace around her throat, her lips parted but no words coming. Sarah had abandoned her phone, her fingers digging into Aiden's arm, her eyes wide. Dad's face was a mask of stone, but the muscle in his jaw ticked. I pulled the door open wider. The 3 men stepped inside, brushing snow from their coats. The one in front removed his gloves with slow precision before speaking. "Miss Francisco," he said, his voice carrying easily across the dining room, "we are here at your request. Shall we begin?" The ripple of shock that moved through the room was almost visible. Gasps, a stifled laugh, a cough that turned into a choke. They had spoken my name. Not Sarah's, not Nancy's, not Dad's, mine. Leona rose gracefully from her chair, her smile calm and certain. "Perfect timing," she said, gesturing toward me as if the night had been orchestrated on a stage. "Jessie, shall we?" I nodded once. "Yes, bring it in." The men moved with practiced ease, carrying sleek black cases that gleamed beneath the chandelier's light. They set them on the sideboard, snapping them open to reveal neat stacks of folders, embossed invitations, and bound agreements. The sight of it all, formal and undeniable, stole the air from the room. Sarah finally found her voice, though it cracked. "What is this? Some kind of performance?" One of the men looked at her. Briefly, his expression unreadable, then returned his gaze to me. "These are the documents finalizing Clean Horizons' expansion in Nashville. Tonight marks the official launch." Nancy's laugh rang out sharp and desperate. "You can't be serious. At Christmas dinner, this is ridiculous." Leona's eyes cut toward her, cool and steady. "What's ridiculous is pretending Jessie hasn't built something remarkable. Tonight isn't about theatrics, it's about acknowledgement." Dad pushed back from the table, his chair screeching against the floor. His voice rumbled low, full of strain. "Enough. Jessie, if you think parading strangers into my home gives you some kind of authority, you're mistaken." I turned to face him fully. The firelight caught the lines on his face, the hard set of his mouth, the fury in his eyes. "It's not your home anymore, Dad. Not in the way you think. This house might carry your name, but tonight the world walked through my door, not yours." The words hit him squarely, and for once he had no quick retort. Leona stepped closer to me, lowering her voice so only I could hear, though the entire table strained to catch it. "Do you want them to stay, Jessie? Or should I send them back outside and let the silence linger?" Looked over my family once more. Sarah's smirk was gone, replaced with a pale unease. Nancy's fingers trembled against her glass. Dad stood rigid, but the crack in his armor had spread wider. "Stay," I said finally, my voice firm. The men nodded and began distributing the documents, laying them on the table before each relative, as though this were not Christmas dinner but a boardroom. My cousins exchanged bewildered glances. My uncles shifted uncomfortably. Leona raised her glass, her tone calm and resonant. "To Clean Horizon. To Jessie. To build a future that cannot be ignored." Her words hung in the air, undeniable. I lifted my glass too. My hand was steady. The woman who had been invisible at this table for years was gone. For the first time they all had to see me, and the knock that had opened the door to this night was only the beginning. The silence that followed Leona's toast was brittle, stretched so thin it felt like the clink of a fork could split it apart. The stack of contracts lay across the table like foreign objects, their clean edges cutting into the cozy illusion of Christmas dinner. No one reached for them. No one dared to touch them, as though acknowledging the papers would confirm what they all feared, that the balance of power in this house had shifted. I sat down again, my napkin folded neatly in my lap, and waited. For years I had been the one to fill silences nervously, to smooth tension before it grew teeth. Not anymore. Tonight, the silence was mine. Sarah cracked first. She leaned forward, her hands spread on the table, her voice pitched high with disbelief. Are we really supposed to sit here and pretend this is normal, Jessie? Bringing in suits and contracts like she's running Wall Street from the dining room. Leona's smile didn't falter. She glanced at Sarah the way a teacher looks at a child who hasn't done her homework. What Jessie has built is far more tangible than Wall Street Sarah. Clean Horizon doesn't gamble with numbers. It changes lives. Sarah's laugh was sharp and humorless. Garbage, that's all it is. Trash and recycling. You can wrap it in whatever fancy language you want, but at the end of the day, Jessie plays with garbage. I let her words hang there before answering, my voice calm, steady. Do you know how much revenue the city of Nashville spent on waste management? Last year, $48 million. Do you know how much of that we saved them with our systems? $11 million. $11 million not rotting in landfills. $11 million redirected into schools, infrastructure, community projects. If you call that playing with garbage, I'll take it. Aiden shifted uncomfortably beside her. He tried to tug her back into her chair with a muttered, Sarah enough? But she jerked away, her face red. Nancy was next. Her tone was smoother, more practiced, but her hands betrayed her as she twisted her napkin too tightly. Jessie, darling, it's sweet that you've built something for yourself. But must we ruin Christmas dinner with business talk? This is a family night. I turned to her slowly, catching the gleam of candlelight against her diamond bracelet. You ruined Christmas dinner when you told me I was too stinky to sit at your table. Business talk feels polite compared to that. Her face flushed, her mouth opening and closing as though she might recover, but no words came. Dad finally stood, his towering frame pulling every gaze to him. His voice was lower than before, but the edge of command lingered. Enough of this spectacle. Jessie, if you think you can waltz in here with your limousines and your contracts and humiliate this family, you've lost your mind. Whatever you've built, whatever fantasy you're chasing, it will never change the blood in your veins. You are mine. And as long as that's true, you will never outrun who you are. His words cut, but they no longer pierced. I rose slowly to face him, the flames in the fireplace licking higher behind me, shadows stretching across the walls. I am yours, yes. I am your daughter. But you don't get to define what that means anymore. You call me a disgrace. You call me a trash worker. But when the city signs my contracts, when leaders invite me to the table, when my work is on the front page of business journals, they don't see your name, they see mine. The room froze. For once, Dad didn't have an immediate retort. His jaw worked, his eyes narrowed, but the certainty had drained from his voice. Leona lifted her glass again, her voice soft but unwavering. And that mark is why Jessie doesn't need your approval. She has already surpassed your shadow. The weight of her words pressed against every person in the room. An uncle cleared his throat, mumbling something about politics. A cousin shifted uncomfortably, his eyes glued to the contracts as though afraid they might bite. Sarah laughed again, brittle and forced. This is insane! 10 LIMOS contracts at Christmas, Jessie. Who are you trying to impress? Because no one here is buying it. I leaned forward slightly, meeting her eyes. I'm not trying to impress anyone. I'm making sure no one ever forgets again. Her face faltered, the smirk slipping. The tension built like a storm cloud. The fire popped, sending a spark into the air, and every head turned toward it, as though grateful for the distraction. But the storm didn't pass. It only grew heavier. Dad finally dropped back into his chair, the weight of his body making the wood groan. He poured himself another glass of wine, his hand trembling just enough for the bottle to clink against the rim. Nancy straightened her blouse, her voice clipped. Well, I suppose Jessie has made her point. Shall we move on before dessert melts? But the night refused to move on. The men Leona had brought began to collect signatures, passing pens down the table. Some relatives signed quickly, their hands shaking, eager to appease. Others hesitated, glancing at Dad for direction. He offered none. When the last folder was closed, Leona gathered them neatly, her expression calm and assured. She stood and placed a hand lightly on my shoulder again. History was made tonight, she said. Whether they admit it now or later, it won't change what happened here. I looked around the table one last time. Sarah pale and quiet now, her phone forgotten. At Nancy, her lips pressed so tightly they had turned white. At Dad, slumped in his chair, staring into his wine as if it might offer answers. The power had shifted, and for the first time in my life it was in my hands. But deep down I knew this was only the beginning. The signatures had been gathered, the contracts sealed, but the air in the dining room had only grown heavier. It felt like a storm held inside four walls pressing against the windows, rattling the silverware, daring someone to break the silence. I sat tall in my chair, the napkin folded across my lap, the warmth of the fire brushing against my skin. But inside I was ice cold and deliberate. Dad shifted first. He set his wine glass down with a thud that made half the table jump. His face was flushed, not only from the alcohol, but from the humiliation he couldn't swallow. "Enough," he said, his voice rough-strained. "This little charade ends now." No one breathed. He leaned forward, both palms flat on the table, his eyes burning into mine. "You think you can humiliate me in my own house? You think you can drag strangers in here, disrupt Christmas, and rewrite who we are, Jesse? You have always been small. And no limousine, no contract, no CEO sitting at your side will ever change that." His words came like daggers, sharp and practiced, the same cruelty he had wielded for years. But tonight they no longer found their mark. I placed my hands calmly on the table fingers, relaxed. "Dad, the only thing small tonight is your world. You've spent your life building a kingdom of fear around this table. But fear doesn't last forever. Eventually people see the cracks, and tonight the cracks are showing." Nancy bristled beside him, her hand tightening on his arm, her voice dripping with venom. "Jesse, you've embarrassed yourself enough. Do you think anyone at this table is impressed? We see you for what you are. A sanitation worker in a borrowed dress playing at being important." Leona turned her head slowly, her gaze landing on Nancy like a spotlight. "Borrowed?" she asked, her voice calm, cutting. "That dress is custom. I know because I sent it to Jesse myself. And sanitation. Tell me, Nancy, what industry would you prefer, one where people build nothing and inherit everything?" Nancy flushed, her lips pressing tight, but she didn't respond. I leaned back slightly, letting the tension breathe before speaking again. "The difference, Nancy, is that I don't need to insult anyone at this table to make myself feel powerful. My work speaks for itself. Can you say the same?" Her eyes darted away, the weight of my words sinking deeper than she wanted anyone to see. Sarah slammed her palm against the table, the sudden sound jolting the room. "Oh, please, enough of this fairy tale. Jesse, you've always been a mess. You dropped out of college. Remember, you lived in a one-bedroom apartment that reeked of bleach. You used to beg Dad for gas money. And now you want us to believe you're some kind of mogul? This is pathetic." Her words tumbled out, fast, desperate, the way people speak when they feel their power slipping. I turned toward her slowly, meeting her eyes with a steadiness that made her flinch. "Yes, Sarah. I scrubbed the floors. I lived in that apartment. I begged for gas money. And I survived every single day you would never have lasted. Those years built me. They taught me how to fight when no one believed in me. You call that pathetic. I call it foundation." She faltered, her mouth opening, but no comeback forming. Aiden shifted beside her, his face pale, clearly wishing he could disappear. Leona lifted her glass again, her tone smooth. "Sarah, do you know what most venture investors look for? Not pedigree. Not a shiny resume. They look for resilience. For proof that someone can fall and still rise higher. Jessie has that in abundance. That's why people back her. That's why I back her." The room rippled with unease. Cousins whispered, uncles coughed, the weight of truth pressing harder than anyone wanted to admit. Dad's fist slammed down again, harder this time, rattling the plates. "Don't talk to my family like you know them," he barked at Leona. His eyes swung back to me, wild now, the cracks in his armor spreading. "And don't you dare sit there and act like you've won. You may have fooled outsiders with your little company, but you will never replace blood. You will never replace me." The fire roared behind me, sparks rising into the chimney. I rose slowly, my shadow stretching across the table, taller than I had ever felt in this house. "I'm not trying to replace you," I said, my voice low but unwavering. "I'm showing you that I never needed you to begin with." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the hum of the limousines outside seemed to fade. Nancy reached for her glass again, her hand trembling, her voice brittle. "Mark, sit down. She's not worth it." But he didn't sit. He stared at me, his chest heaving, his world unraveling in front of an audience he had always controlled. Sarah broke the silence again, her voice shrill. "You're tearing this family apart, Jesse. Is that what you wanted? To ruin Christmas? To humiliate Dad? To destroy everything we've built?" I turned to her, my gaze steady. "I didn't tear this family apart. It was already broken. You just never noticed because you were too busy polishing the pieces." Her face was drained of color. She reached for her phone again, desperate for something to shield herself, but her hand shook too much to hold it steady. Leona leaned forward slightly, her eyes sweeping the table. "What Jesse has shown tonight isn't destruction, it's true. Sometimes truth feels like fire. But fire also clears the ground for new growth. Her words landed soft but undeniable. Dad sank back into his chair. Finally, his eyes still locked on me, but his shoulders slumped. Nancy whispered something to him, but he didn't answer. I sat again, the napkin smoothing across my lap like a seal on the night. The storm had broken, and for the first time I wasn't standing in its center as the target. I was standing in it. But even as the quiet settled, I knew the fight wasn't over. There were secrets still buried in this family, shadows still lurking beneath the silver and glass. And as I looked at Sarah's trembling hands, at Nancy's clenched jaw, at Dad's hollow stare, I realized the biggest secret of all was about to surface. I took a slow sip of wine, set the glass down, and let my voice carry across the table. Do you really want to talk about disgrace? Because if we're opening that door, I'm ready to tell the truth about this family. The words hung in the air like a match poised above gasoline, and in their silence, I knew I had struck the nerve that would unravel everything. The words slipped from my mouth like stones dropped into still water. Do you really want to talk about disgrace? Because if we're opening that door, I'm ready to tell the truth about this family. The room froze. Forks stopped halfway to mouths, glasses hovered untouched. My father's eyes narrowed into slits, his jaw tightening like a vice. Nancy's hand stilled on her wine glass, the pale pink polish on her nails flashing in the candlelight. Sarah shifted in her chair, the smirk gone, replaced by a wariness she couldn't hide. I could feel the weight of every gaze pressing against me, waiting, daring me to speak. For years I had swallowed words like these, burying them under layers of obedience and shame. But tonight, with the limousines idling outside, with Leona sitting like a sentinel at my side, I felt no fear. You want to call me a disgrace? I said, my voice steady. But maybe we should look closer at the people doing the pointing. A murmur rippled across the table. One of my uncles coughed into his napkin. An aunt glanced nervously at Nancy, her lips pursed so tight they nearly disappeared. Dad leaned forward, his voice a growl. Don't you dare! I met his eyes unblinking. Why not? You've made a sport of humiliating me in front of this family my entire life. You've called me worthless, lazy, a failure. But I kept your secrets. I stayed silent when I shouldn't have. Maybe it's time the silence ends. Nancy's voice cracked like a whip. Jessie, stop this childish game right now. You've already embarrassed yourself enough. I turned to her, my gaze sharp. Embarrass me, Nancy. Do you really want me to tell them where all those weekend trips to Atlanta really were? Because it wasn't a spa retreat. Was it? The color drained from her face. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her hand clutched at her pearls, the glassy clink loud in the silence. A gasp came from the far end of the table. My cousin set down her fork with a clatter, her eyes wide. Dad's face turned a dangerous shade of red. Shut your mouth. But I didn't. Or should we talk about the money? I continued, my voice cutting through his anger. The accounts hidden under Sarah's name. The transfers that no one was supposed to notice. I found them, Dad. I found everything. Sarah's chair screeched against the floor as she pushed back, her face pale, her hands trembling. You're lying. You're making things up to make yourself look better. Leona spoke for the first time since my words began to unravel the night. Her voice was calm, almost soothing. She isn't lying. I've seen the files. The room erupted in murmurs, shocked voices overlapping. A cousin asked Sarah directly, Is that true? Another relative whispered, my God, under her breath. Sarah's eyes darted wildly, looking for an escape. But Aiden leaned away from her, his expression cold now, his hand no longer reaching for hers. Dad slammed his fist against the table, making the silverware jump. Enough. This is slander. Lies from a bitter girl who can't stand her sister's success. I laughed softly, the sound bitter. Success. Do you mean the engagement bought with stolen money, or the designer ring that came from funds meant for your company's payroll? Which part is success to you, Dad? Sarah's lips trembled. You don't know what you're talking about. But she knew I did, and so did everyone else. Leona leaned back slightly, her hands folded elegantly in her lap. Jessie, you don't have to prove anything tonight. The truth has a way of proving itself, but sometimes it needs a voice. Her words steadied me further. I looked back at Dad, his face twisted with rage, his authority slipping through his fingers. For years you controlled the narrative. You decided who mattered and who didn't. But tonight the truth sits at this table. And whether you like it or not, everyone here will remember what was said. The fire roared behind me, throwing sparks up the chimney. Nancy's voice finally cracked, brittle and breaking. You'll regret this, Jessie. You think you've won something here, but you've destroyed this family. No one will forgive you. I turned my gaze to her. Forgiveness is for people who admit what they've done. You've never once apologized for the way you treated me, for the things you said. You don't want forgiveness. You want silence. The weight of those words pressed against her until she slumped back into her chair, her shoulders tight, her eyes darting anywhere but at me. Sarah whispered something to herself, her fingers clawing at her phone like it might save her. But Aiden stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly. "I think I've heard enough," he said flatly. His voice carried across the table, final and cutting. He didn't look at Sarah again as he walked toward the door, his footsteps echoing. The slam of the door behind him was like a judge's gavel. Sarah's face crumpled, her breath sharp, tears threatening. For the first time that night, Dad looked lost. His mouth opened, then closed, the fury inside him struggling to find purchase. I lifted my glass and took a slow sip, letting the wine burn just slightly down my throat. This isn't the end. It's only the beginning. Tonight, the truth walked through that door and it isn't leaving. The silence that followed was not the silence of dismissal, not the silence of me shrinking into invisibility. It was the silence of reckoning, and as I set my glass down, the sound ringing clear, I knew that the next secret was waiting to be spoken. The silence after Aiden left was thick enough to choke on. His footsteps still echoed in my ears, fading into the cold night where the limousines waited, engines humming like a heartbeat. No one at the table dared to speak. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the faint clinking of a spoon against porcelain as someone's trembling hand betrayed them. I looked around the table, slowly letting my gaze linger on each face. Some looked away immediately. Others tried to hold my eyes and failed. For the first time, I wasn't the one shrinking under the weight of silence. They were. "You think you know disgrace," I said softly, my voice cutting through the stillness. "But disgrace is hiding secrets so ugly you'd rather bury me than face them." Nancy stiffened, her manicured fingers tightening around her glass. "Don't you dare," but I cut her off. "Do you want to tell them about the debts?" "Nancy, the loans you signed under Dad's name without him knowing, or should?" Her lips parted, a sharp breath escaping. The room seemed to contract, everyone leaning forward slightly, their curiosity battling with dread. Dad's head snapped toward her. "What loans?" His voice was low, dangerous. Nancy swallowed hard, her painted smile faltering. "She's twisting things. Jessie doesn't know what she's talking about." Leona's voice was calm even. "Actually, she does. We ran a full background check when Jessie and I partnered. The debts are real, and they're not small." The color drained from Nancy's face. She set her glass down too hard, the stem snapping clean off. Wine bled across the white cloth like a wound. A gasp escaped from one of my aunts. A cousin whispered something about foreclosure. Dad's fists clenched against the table, his face turning a shade of red I had seen only a handful of times in my life. "You lied to me," he hissed at Nancy. "You signed my name?" Nancy tried to recover her voice, trembling. "It was for us, Mark, for this family, to keep the estate afloat. But the damage was done." Sarah, pale and shaking, suddenly lashed out, her voice shrill. "This is ridiculous. You're tearing us apart, Jessie. You think you're some kind of savior, but you're just bitter. You're jealous of me, of everything I have." I turned to her, my voice steady. "Jealous of what?" "The fiancé who just walked out the door, the secret, accounts you thought no one would notice, or the way you smile at strangers, while stabbing your own sister in the back." Her breath hitched, her hand gripping the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles whitened. "You don't know anything, but I did. You posted a picture tonight," I said, my tone sharp. "A dumpster with a tiara emoji. You thought it was clever. But do you know what else I saw on your phone messages? Plans you made with Dad to cut me out completely, to erase me." Sarah's face went white. She looked at Dad, desperate for denial, but his eyes betrayed the truth. Leona leaned forward, her hands folded elegantly. "I've seen those messages too." The table erupted. Relatives gasped, voices overlapping, chairs scraping against the floor as people shifted. Sarah shook her head violently. "She's lying. She hacked me, But the panic in her voice told everyone enough. Dad slammed his hand down, the sound like a gunshot. "Stop it, both of you. This family will not be torn apart by lies." I leaned forward, my voice calm but searing. "The lies are what tore it apart in the first place. I'm just dragging them into the light." Nancy rose suddenly, her chair toppling backward. Her eyes darted wildly, her voice rising. "You don't know what you're doing, Jessie. You're destroying us." I stood to, facing her fully. "No, Nancy, I'm freeing us from the rot you and Dad and Sarah built into this family." The words hung there, heavy, impossible to ignore. The fire roared higher, sparks bursting into the chimney. Outside, the limousines hummed, waiting like silent judges. For years, I had been the quiet one, the overlooked one, the girl they mocked and dismissed. But tonight, I was the voice they couldn't silence, and as I looked at their faces, Dad's fury, Nancy's panic, Sarah's fear, I knew I had only just begun. The dining room felt like it was tilting, the walls pressing inward as though the house itself couldn't contain the weight of what had been spoken. Nancy stood trembling, her glass shattered at her feet, red wine bleeding across the rug like evidence. Sarah clutched her phone in one hand, her breathing ragged, her knuckles white. Dad sat rigid at the head of the table, his eyes dark, his hands clenched into fists so tight I thought his skin might split. I remained standing, my hands steady on the back of my chair. My voice, when it came, was calm, too calm. You call me a disgrace, a trash worker, an embarrassment. But let's put the real disgrace on the table, shall we? The relatives shifted uncomfortably. Some glanced toward the door as though they wished they could escape. Others stared at me with wide, hungry eyes, unwilling to miss a moment. Leona didn't move. She sat serene, her gaze fixed on me, her presence solid as stone. She didn't need to speak. Her silence alone said she already knew what was coming. I turned back to Dad. You've built this image of power, of control. But power doesn't come from bullying your family at the dinner table. It comes from integrity. And you lost that a long time ago. His face darkened. Watch yourself. No, I said, my voice sharp. You watch yourself. I reached into my bag. For a moment, the room seemed to stop breathing. I pulled out a black folder thick with papers. My hand brushed the smooth surface as I laid it on the table, sliding it forward until it sat directly in front of Dad's plate. These are the records, I said evenly. Transfers, loans, accounts, signatures. Every debt Nancy signed, every secret account Sarah laundered. Every deal you made behind closed doors. The room erupted in murmurs, whispers, rippling like fire through dry grass. Dad's hand shot out, slamming on the folder, his eyes wild. Where did you get this? From the same people who signed contracts with me. Tonight, I answered calmly. From the same world you think I'll never belong to? They don't play favorites. They play with facts, and the facts don't lie. Nancy's voice cracked desperate now. She forged it. She must have. Mark, don't listen. Leona finally spoke, her tone smooth measured. I personally verified every document in that folder. They're real. You can deny it all you like, but denial doesn't change the truth. Sarah stood abruptly, her chair screeching against the floor. This is insane. Jessie hacked me. She's trying to ruin me. I turned my gaze on her, steady and unflinching. You ruined yourself when you thought no one would notice. You wanted me erased, but tonight it's your mask that's been erased. Her face crumpled. Tears slid down her cheeks as she shook her head, but no words came. Dad's fist came down on the folder again, rattling the silverware. You think you've won, Jessie. You think humiliating your own family makes you strong? All you've done tonight is prove you're ruthless. You're cold. You're nothing without this family's name. I leaned forward slightly, my voice soft but cutting. Nothing without you. Look around, Dad. I've built something you can't control. And that terrifies you. The fire roared higher, casting shadows that danced across the walls like restless spirits. Nancy collapsed back into her chair, her shoulders slumping. She muttered something under her breath, too low for anyone to catch. Sarah sobbed quietly, her phone slipping from her hand to the floor with a dull thud. The relatives whispered, shifting in their seats, their eyes darting between Dad and me as though watching a duel that had no escape. Leona stood, then her presence commanding, her voice carrying easily across the room. This is not humiliation. This is a revelation. Jessie didn't tear this family apart. She showed you what was already broken. And whether you accept it tonight or not, nothing will ever be the same. The words landed like thunder. Dad's breathing grew louder, heavier. His eyes flicked to Nancy, then to Sarah, then back to me. His hand clenched on the folder, veins standing out starkly. You think you've destroyed me? He said, his voice low, dangerous. But you don't know what I'm capable of. The threat in his tone was clear. I met his gaze unflinching. Neither do you. The silence that followed was electric. Every person at the table caught between fear and awe. And then from outside, a new sound cut through the hum of the limousines. The crunch of boots in the snow. More than one pair. Steady. Purposeful. The door, still ajar from earlier, creaked wider. Shadows moved across the porch, tall and deliberate. The entire room turned to watch. The night wasn't over. And whatever was about to enter would decide how it ended. The heavy footsteps on the porch grew louder, steady against the crunch of snow. Every head in the dining room turned toward the door. The fire snapped, throwing sparks into the silence. My heart beat steady in my chest, not with fear, but with certainty. The first figure stepped into the doorway, his dark coat dusted with snowflakes, the collar turned up against the cold. Behind him came two more and then another. They were not strangers to me. They were colleagues, allies, partners who had walked beside me in building the very thing my father had dismissed as garbage. Their presence filled the room with a new gravity, one that even my father could not command. I straightened my shoulders and met their eyes. Each one gave me a slight nod, an acknowledgement that tonight was not about theatrics, but about truth. Leona rose gracefully, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor. She extended her hand to the first man, her voice calm and clear. "Thank you for coming." My father's voice cut through the air, sharp and biting. "What the hell is this? You invite outsiders into my house, into my family dinner." I turned to him, my voice steady. "You made this house a place of humiliation. I made it a place of reckoning." The words struck harder than I expected. Dad's face flushed deep red, his jaw tightening, his fists clenched at his sides. Nancy reached for his arm, whispering something desperate, but he shook her off. Sarah sat rigid, her eyes darting from me to the door. Panic etched across her face. The man in the doorway stepped forward, laying a slim leather case on the table with a quiet click. He looked around the room, then back at me. "It's all here," he said simply. I opened the case and spread the contents across the linen tablecloth. Contracts, balance sheets, signed agreements, proof of partnerships stretching across states and cities. Everything Clean Horizon had become, and everything my family had denied me. Gasps rippled around the table. A cousin leaned forward, eyes wide. An uncle shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Sarah's phone slipped from her trembling hands, clattering onto the floor. I placed my hand on the top page, my voice calm. "This is what I've built. Not in secret, not in shame, but in plain sight for anyone who cared enough to look. You called me a disgrace, a trash worker too dirty to sit at your table. But tonight you're sitting at mine." The words hung in the air like smoke. Dad lunged forward, snatching at the papers. His hands trembled as he flipped through them, his eyes darting over the signatures and figures. The deeper he looked, the paler his face became. Finally, he slammed the folder shut, his voice shaking with fury. "These mean nothing. Paper doesn't change who you are." Leona stepped closer, her voice smooth but sharp. "No, but they change who listens. Every investor, every partner, every official who matters has already seen these. The world has already shifted. You just haven't caught up." Nancy's lips pressed into a thin line, her face drained of color. She looked down at her lap, her manicured hands trembling. "Mark," she whispered, "we can't fight this." Sarah let out a strangled sob. "This isn't fair. She doesn't deserve any of this." I turned my gaze to her. "Fair? Do you think it was fair when you mocked me online? When you spread lies about me? When you laughed as Dad tore me down in front of everyone? Fairness was never the game you played. But justice? Justice doesn't ask for permission." Her sobs grew louder, her mascara streaking down her cheeks. She reached for Aiden's hand, but he pulled away, his face tight with discomfort. He had been silent all evening, but now his eyes avoided hers. Even he could see the truth unraveling. My father's voice thundered again. "You think this is justice? You think humiliating us at Christmas dinner makes you strong? You're nothing but a parasite living off other people's work." I stepped closer, my voice low but fierce. "No, Dad. I am at work. I built this from the ground up. I stayed awake when everyone else slept. I lifted what others threw away. And I turned it into something no one can ignore. You can call it trash if you want, but the world has already named it the future." The room was silent. Every relative sat frozen, their eyes fixed on me. Even the fire seemed quiet. The only sound was the faint hum of engines from the limousines outside. Leona spoke again, her voice carrying authority. "Mark, Nancy, Sarah. Tonight you witnessed what happens when truth refuses to be buried. Jessie didn't come here to destroy you. She came here to stop hiding. Whether you accept it or not, her life will go on. Stronger, brighter, without your permission." My father collapsed back into his chair, his chest heaving, his eyes glassy with rage and something else, something that looked like fear. I gathered the papers back into the folder, sliding them neatly into the case. Then I straightened my hands, steady, my voice calm. "I didn't come here to beg for your approval. I came here to remind myself that I don't need it." Sarah buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. Nancy stared at the floor, her silence louder than any insult she had ever thrown. My father's eyes burned into me, but his words had lost their power. I turned toward the door, my heels clicking softly against the floor. At the threshold, I paused and looked back one last time. The faces around the table, once filled with scorn and mockery, now sat in stunned silence. "You asked if I was the disgrace of this family," I said quietly. "But tonight, the only disgrace I see is the silence that let cruelty live here for so long." And then I stepped outside. The cold air met me like a baptism, sharp and clean. Snowflakes drifted softly under the glow of the porch light. The 10 limousines still lined the driveway, their engines humming in patient unison. The drivers stood ready, their breath visible in the night air. Leona joined me, her coat wrapped tightly around her shoulders. She looked at me with a small smile, her eyes warm. "You didn't even have to raise your voice," she said softly. I exhaled, my breath clouding in the cold. For the first time in years, I felt light. Not triumphant, not vindictive, just free. The door behind me remained closed. Whatever arguments, excuses, or denials happened inside were no longer mine to hear. That chapter of my life had ended. I walked down the steps, the snow crunching beneath my heels. One of the drivers opened the door of the nearest limousine. I paused, glancing back at the house one last time. The Christmas lights twinkled against the dark sky, but their glow no longer felt like a weight pressing on me. I slid into the car, the leather seat cool against my palms. As the door closed softly behind me, I let out a long breath. For years, I had carried their words like chains. Tonight, I left them behind. And to anyone listening now, to anyone who has ever been told you're not enough, who has ever been dismissed, belittled, or mocked for the work of your hands, let me tell you this: you don't need their permission to rise. You don't need their applause to matter. You don't need their seat at the table when you can build your own. That was the lesson I learned on Christmas night, when the laughter turned to silence, and the silence turned to truth. And if you've ever wondered when it will be your time, maybe it starts tonight. So tell me, have you ever had to walk away from the people who should have loved you most, just to become who you were meant to be? Share your story in the comments. Like this video if you believe in second chances. And subscribe for more stories, because somewhere out there, someone needs to know they're not alone.